Commission funded project by the SWAFs, the Science with and for Society program. Panelfit is integrated for 11 multidisciplinary groups from European countries with expertise in the fields of law, social communications, ICT, and other. It is coordinated by myself with the collaboration of my colleague and friend, Professor Íñigo de Miguel, who acts as deputy coordinator, brought from the University of the Basque Country in Spain, and as you know, from the chair in law and the human genome. When we submitted the application for this project to the European Commission, we were aware that the new regulatory framework on data protection was changing dramatically. In fact, it was only recently that the important General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, was approved by the European institutions. Taking into account this important new legal framework for the 27 European countries, we took as a main objective to encourage the creation of data markets that enable fair data commercialization while ensuring at the same time the protection of autonomy through decisive support of individual informed consent and supporting the implementation of sustainable security systems. Thus, from this basic idea, we draw the three pillars of the project: data commercialization, informed consent, security and cybersecurity, and consequently, the four main objectives of Panelfit are to facilitate the implementation of this new regulation by producing a set of outcomes that serve as operational standards and practical guidelines, able to reduce the ethical and legal issues posed by the ICT while promoting innovation and market growth, enabling high-quality job creation and ensuring a high level of privacy and security and cybersecurity. To suggest possible concrete improvements to the current regulatory and governance framework for the same purposes was also the second objective, main objective of Panelfit. And then the third one was to create mutual learning and support tools and to promote networking among stakeholders and policymakers. And finally, to increase the quantity and quality of the information available to policymakers, professionals, journalists, and lay people as well. As the right tasks of the former objectives, we decided to provide applicable guidelines, recommendations, and dissemination activities among other that are of the most relevance. Also, we have given priority to permanent communication means and activities, related activities. Consequently, the outcomes that we have addressed along this time have been to develop and to prepare some guidelines as a handbook for the decision makers. The task of critical analysis, sorry, this is most addressed to policymakers, that are issues and gaps analysis suggestions for improve the system. Report on governance that is also addressed especially to policy makers. That is a comparative analysis of national and regional regulations. So the code of conduct for responsible research and innovation, it has been addressed specifically to researchers, as you can understand. That is adapted to the concrete needs of researchers. That they, as you know, they have many situations that are more specific and need for also specific considerations. And so the handbook for journalists that it has been also addressed specifically for to journalists is to the concrete needs of journalists when they are performing their work. They're very important for our societies. And finally, the citizens info pack addressed to citizens in general as considers that they could be considered lay people, and in two different versions. One of them tailored to the different situations that I have, sorry, to the needs of citizenship. As it has been scheduled, the end of this morning, at the end of this morning, Inigo de Miguel will explain you the main and most relevant outcomes of Panelfit, taking into account these activities that I have just recorded. Well, for more than 3 years, Panelfit members have been working together to fulfill the commitments we made when we took on the project with the European Commission. For the success of our work, we have first of all had to get to know each other better, to know our specialties and qualifications in more detail, our ways of working, or individual or teams' ways of working, how to keep the permanent contact and coordination, even to take care of our respective personalities that we have not to forget. We have had to solve some problems of organization and reorientation or focus of our work, largely affected by the pandemic, as all of you know. Sorry. Despite this and other difficulties, we have been able to solve and overcome them, thanks also to the understanding and permanent support of our officers at the European Commission, in particular, Roberta, always open. She's an extraordinary lady and ready to help us. I would like also to remember the works that have performed in this same direction by Lisa, as you know, also Alvena, during the time she was working with us. So, as it is said in my country, all's well that ends well. And so I think, congratulate all the members of Panelfit for your dedication, for your qualification, and for your permanent willingness to meet the objectives of our project. We have learned to work together in harmony and constructively when there were some differences of points of view. And thanks so to everybody, thanks also to the members who couldn't attend our final meeting today. I would now like to highlight the enormous work carried out by Inigo. Inigo, where are you? There. Okay, Inigo. In the material coordination of the project, he has always been attentive to all incidents that have arisen through the execution of the project during this very, very long 3 years, more than 3 years. And as I said before, with the pandemic flying there. So attentive to the meetings, deadlines of each specific objective and each program activity, always with a good disposition and practical vision. No one has escaped. Everyone has been reminded of what had to be done at all times. Thank you very much, Inigo, for your perseverance and your generous dedication. I am personally very deeply grateful to you, as you know, as you also have been able to efficiently cover my personal difficulties I have had at times during the life of the project of Panelfit. I would also like to thank Aliuska Duardo and Monica Aloyo Menoyo for their efficient dedication in the management of such complex projects. Many thanks also to both of them. So I don't want to forget any person that has been involved in the project. So I think that I have also to be grateful for everybody, but at this moment maybe I could forget. Before giving way to the other presentations this morning, I would like to thank the Vrije University of Brussels for having hosted this event, and especially to Professor De Geer. And also I wish to address my warmest thanks to the Italian team, especially to Alessandro and Carlota. I can see Carlota is there. Thank you, Carlota and Alessandro, for your work preparing this today's meeting. My thanks to speakers, also to speakers for taking today the floor. So I will finish this short presentation and this short welcome, all of you. I would just like to wish you all an enjoyable meeting. And so that is our last my meeting we have in relation with Panelfit. So I have to say you that I was very, very honored to be the coordinator of this project. And so to have the opportunity to meet colleagues from different academic or other high-level centers in Europe. So I think that in this morning we will be able to to take a quick look at the last remaining points to close our work in order to finish Panelfit. Thanks you very much to all of you. Thank you again. Sandro, please.
Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you, Professor. Next speaker today is Mr. Wojciech Wieworowski from European Data Protection Supervisor. Please welcome him on the stage.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Dear participants of the project, thank you for invitation to the European Data Protection Supervisor to this outstanding event and the possibility to tell a few words about our approach to the foresight in the European Data Protection Supervisor's Office. As you probably know, European Data Protection Supervisor is first of all the data protection authority of the EU institutions, bodies and agencies, and at the same time does not play the role of the supranational data protection agency. This is the agency which is dealing with the EU bodies and EU institutions, while in all the other member states of the European Union, there are the national data protection authorities, supervisory authorities that are dealing with the subjects on the national level. But what is probably more important for today's discussion, the European Data Protection Supervisor is also the main advisor in the legislative process of the European Union. Starting from the very beginning, when the Commission is preparing the draft of the possible regulation, and through the process of work in the Council and in the Parliament, and then in the implementation phase of this project. We are also providing the Secretariat to the European Data Protection Board that consists of all the data protection authorities all over Europe. So the looking ahead and trying to anticipate what will happen in the technology world, but also how the legal regulations should reflect it, is one of the main tasks of the EDPS. Giving the mandate of the EDPS, I'm happy to represent here today the institution in front of the audience and together with such a great panel experts. And I'm thrilled to talk and listen about the crucial topics of anticipatory compliance. And I hope to demonstrate throughout my speech today that this anticipatory compliance is the approach of our times, and it demands us to develop, adopt, and master. It's clear that today, with all the experiences of the COVID-19 pandemic, we will have the lesson learned to observe. Together with the grief of so many lost lives, and with the challenge of bringing our economy and society up to speed, and above all, we have learned that the world can change quickly. The path from normality to completely different world that we already forgotten about is very short. One day I woke up and I found out that somebody has stolen my Europe. My Europe, which was an open continent, where I could travel, where I could work in different places, and took me back to the Europe of closed borders, which I was born in. I was born in Poland, 1971, and by the time I went to the university, there was no possibility even for me to go abroad and to work together with the people in Western Europe. And then I enjoyed for 25 years the very open society and very open continent. And one day it has been taken out by COVID. But once the border was closed, the digital space wasn't. Moreover, we found out that maybe if the countries might be sovereign in the meaning that they can close their borders, they cannot close the digital world. They cannot live without each other. And the recent events unfolding at the eastern border of the European Union, which threatens the very core of the European democracy and values, is another example of how fast we can go from normality to strange situation. But the effect of these catastrophic events cannot be considered as a point in time. No, the consequences will be long-lasting. As we see today on the already high and possibly growing inflation, and on the rising increase of price of raw materials. Such events caught us off guard, leaving us with the consequences of this unpreparedness. I will go back just 2 years when no one would ever imagine the situation that we have. In first days of 2020, when I started my term as the European Data Protection Supervisor, I started to prepare the strategy for the institution for next 4 years. And just in 3 months, when I was ready to present it, everything has changed. And we had to take into consideration the new approach to this next 4 years. And that was also the moment when we decided to include in the strategy of EDPS the foresight as one of the pillars of our activities. So at the same time, we have also realized that there is a room for maneuver whereby we can understand the changes, we can anticipate the changes, and we can go directly towards the more sustainable future. So what lesson can we learn within our community of technology regulators from the major events that happened last 2 years? In our work, we are confronted daily with the challenges coming from the continuous flow of technological innovation to solve the new and to solve the old problems. But growing complexity of the technological society is facing an unprecedented factor, the speed of change. Someone hinted this decades ago. In 1965, Gordon Moore hypothesized that the number of transistors in microprocessors would double every 12 months. That's the famous Moore law. And this became self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, if we consider the surface of the impressive evolution from fintech to metaverse, from artificial intelligence to biometrics, you can see how difficult it has become for the authority like the European Data Protection Supervisor to find effective ways to intervene in these processes and take timely actions. The more we advance in our work, the more we are convinced that we as data protection authorities, but also as the controllers and as the processors, we need the new tools and new skills. And we are convinced that we cannot continue our mission to try and enforce technologies without being anticipative and look how the evolution will look like. We at EDPS have convinced are convinced that acceleration of the technological change that took place in the consequence of COVID-19 makes these capacities even more necessary. Let me remind you that General Data Protection Regulation in the Recital 4 states, processing of personal data should be designed to serve mankind. For this to happen at such complex time, we are convinced that there's an increasing importance to act in advance. In other words, instead of reacting to the new emerging technologies, we should anticipate them. We should be able to find out how the development will come. In this way, we can foresee the risks and better support the value creation process of these technologies. As the result, we will nurture their development towards respect of fundamental rights and interests of individuals, reducing the risk from the earlier stages of their adoption. I'm sure that the speakers today will follow with elaborate better than I can on the concept of foresight, but let me say a few words how we see it in practice, having this pillar in our strategy. To us, foresight is the set of toolboxes, a set of practical and very powerful instruments that we need to use with due attention with due attention in order to explore, anticipate, and shape the future. I would like to stop for a second and stress this S in futures. The massive flow of technology innovation that I referred to can lead to a set of diversified scenarios, and we have to deal with all of these diversified scenarios. To understand this, we cannot use a more powerful tool than collective intelligence in a structured, systematic, and systemic way to anticipate developments. In the international arena, the European Data Protection Supervisor is among the few personal data protection authorities, few data protection supervisory authorities that has taken active steps in the field of foresight of the future. Among the tasks provided to us by the new regulations, EDPS must monitor relevant development insofar as they have an impact on the protection of the personal data, in particular, the development of information and communication technologies. In fact, the EDPS has always been leading institution in the field of technological monitoring, but we have to be better in it. And starting from 2020, as I said, we put it as the pillar to the strategy of EDPS. We are closely examining both the potential risks and opportunities offered by the technological advances. We try to understand them. We try to understand the possibilities of the new technologies, and at the same time, encourage the integration of data protection by design and data protection by default. And if we go to the practical examples, I would like to drive your attention to the new project, which Stefano definitely will tell more about during this meeting, which is a tech sonar. Tech sonar is the initiative which is based on the question, which technologies are worth monitoring today in order to be prepared for the more sustainable digital future where the protection of the personal data is efficiently guaranteed. Result of this analysis has been published in a report in December 2021. Here we describe the technologies that we believe are worth monitoring for another years to come. We invite all of you to visit our website and learn on this chosen technologies and our way of thinking about the future. But the most important aspect I would like to highlight is that we have not selected those technologies because of our personal feeling or perception. But as I said, we based our choice on anticipatory tools and instruments. Let me stress this point. No one today has a crystal ball. The data protection authorities don't have one either. If we will succeed in the Foresight exercises, that's because we adopted good methodologies. And this is something which I would like to learn as much as possible from the projects like the one we observed today. Tech sonar is only a starting point. That's the first outcome where we achieved, we started to think in more anticipatory manner, being more prepared to upcoming technologies during our daily activities. A crucial one is the following finding and the following question. Can anticipatory approach complement the reactive enforcement model? And reaction to the occurrence of an issue can be helpful to correcting the immediate problems. Due to the speed of technological change today, when innovation reaches a mass market, they can produce irreversible, the terminal effect. The world never goes back, and the erosion of the privacy that those technologies are operating by constant and tiny bits need to be anticipated. Not only corrected in the second moment, but seen before it happens. And although we are sure that the reactive enforcement model is still necessary, even if it requires fine-tuning and new questions can be raised, if certain use of technologies, albeit none in the compliance with European standards, have already generated value for the citizens. In short, we are sure that fulfilling this full reactive approach is still the best instrument, but it has to be it has to be supplemented with the very strong side in the future. We did it with the digital currency. And when in 2019, Facebook announced their plans on Libra, we started to work on that. And now we are prepared to serve the European institutions at the time when the discussion about digital currency issued by the European Central Bank is on. We also reacted on the proposals of Google to replace the tracking technologies used to date with federated learning approaches. And we, having the doubts about that, we were able to nudge the Google Privacy Sandbox into research of other privacy-aware tools. And let me conclude by saying that the European Data Protection Supervisor is committed to follow this path. We have GDPR as a benchmark for the other regulations, but we have to remember that this is just a benchmark. This is something which the others are comparing their solutions with. And when we say about state of art, when we say about the changes that may happen in the future, we have to give to that the very practical meaning in the actions of the European Data Protection Supervisor and the other supervisory authorities. For this reason, I would like to make it clear and make a call to all our stakeholders to start elaborating best practices, best methodologies as well, for making anticipatory compliance and the foresight the new normal for the data protection authorities, for all the fundamental rights agencies that are trying to look into the future. Foresight will also be one of the main pillars of what we are preparing for the conference on the future of privacy. On 16th and 17th of June this year, we'll organize in Brussels the conference, which is dealing with the not the changes in the model that we have at the moment, but look ahead how the privacy will look in several years. And despite we will be talking about enforcement mainly, we want to look it also through the foresight lens. I would like the results of today's discussion to flow into the conference, which will be dedicated to enforcement. I'm sure that the adoption of such approach could lead Europe to continue serving the kind of golden standard for the effective protection of privacy in the whole world. I don't believe that we will create one legal act that will serve as a convention on privacy protection on the global level. But I believe that we can share the values, we can share the approach, and we can share our findings on the future development and the possible threats, but also the chances that it gives to us. So, in the name of all EDPS staff, I would like to thank you to take us the possibility to say a few words now about the results that we somehow expect from your project and which we want to find looking to the whole process that you did last years. So thank you very much, and I hope we will have interesting discussion throughout the day.
Thank you, Mr. Wieworowski. So our next speaker today is Alessandro Fernani, who is actually connecting from the other side of the planet. He is a researcher from University of Singapore, and he will speak about Foresight. Let's see if we have Fernani on the speaker and on the video.
Can you see me and hear me?
We do not. Yes, we see you now. Please,
Great.
you have the floor.
Thanks, Alessandro. A great pleasure to be here, even if remotely. So as a quick introduction, I am a researcher and executive educator here at NUS Business School in Singapore. And I do research and I do consulting on Foresight. So today I was given the ambitious task of laying out the basic concept of what is Foresight to serve as an inspiration for the rest of the day. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and very brazen-facedly do just that. I'm not going to talk about how complex is the world or about how poor is our understanding of the complex world. As I've seen from the previous speeches, I think we are on the same page on that. So I'm just going to go very straight and talk with you about a possible solution, which is Foresight capabilities. And I'm going to share my screen now. If I don't hear anything from you, I'll just assume that you see what I can see. It's a bit slow from my side. Apologies for that. All right. So I'll start by introducing the discipline of Foresight. In reality, the discipline is called future studies in academia. Foresight is more of the application of future studies in practice. But in the last few years, the two things are becoming increasingly overlapping. That's why we talk about futures and foresight as an overarching framework to talk about ways to investigate the futures. And what is it about? Well, it's really about the sentence that you see here. What you see here, and I'll let you digest this sentence, is the core tenet, the core definition of foresight. When we investigate the medium and long-term future, since we cannot predict it, we create scenarios to improve decision-making in the present. So I am going to dissect this sentence, and just as a way to dissect it, to introduce it to the basic principles of this. The first thing I want to talk about, I know you already touched upon this in previous speeches, is the future. There is no single future. That is because it has not happened yet. So there is a range of possibilities out there. So we talk about futures in the plural form. But most importantly, when we talk about the futures in Foresight, there is a disambiguation that I would like to bring to the floor early on, which is we're not talking about single point estimates. So when you open up a newspaper, you will hear and learn and read about the future. Most likely it's about single variables projected into the futures, right? Like GDP growth in the future or unemployment in the future. In Foresight, we believe that is quite reductive because variables do affect each other. So what we talk about is the futures in a scenario, in a narrative form. And that is why we are talking about many variables affecting each other. We're not talking about single point estimate. That is the first thing I want to bring to you. Now, the second thing perhaps is also quite important is the time horizon. We talk about the medium and long-term future. Now, by definition, the medium term is usually between the 5 to 20 years time span ahead into the future, and the long term is between 20 to 50 years ahead into the future. While on the other hand, the short term is from now to 5 years ahead. Now, this is really rough because different Foresight experts have a different understanding of this, but just to give you a framework. Now, why do we look at the medium and long-term future? Well, we go back to the distinction between single point estimates and Foresight. If we look at the short-term future with single point estimates variables, most likely the uncertainty is lower and we can do some form of forecasting. Now, you can argue even in the short term, you have to do some forms of foresight, and that's completely true. There is a philosophical discussion about that, which I'm gonna keep at a side for a moment. But by and large, if you use some forms of forecasting in the very short term, barring some outlier and wildcards events such as a pandemic, the forecasts can be useful, right? But really, when we move into the medium and long term, forecasts tend to be a bit less useful because the error rate compounds, right? And the uncertainty increases. And that is why we use futures and foresight methods in the medium and long-term future. And the reason is also because all the decisions we do in the present will pan out in the medium and long-term future. Now, these two graphs that you're seeing here are not completely watertight in that sometimes in some contexts, you will use foresight for the short term, especially when technological advancement is very high. And sometimes you will use forecasting for the long term, for example, in contexts like real estate. But by and large, this is a good distinction. And finally, there is this last part of the sentence that I want to dissect, and I really want to delve deep into this because this is the most important part of foresight. And that is, foresight is important for improving decision-making in the present. In other words, foresight is useful today. Foresight is useful tomorrow, right? It's not something that you speculate about science fiction long-term futures. It's really something that improves your practice now. And just to explain how this is possible conceptually, I'm going to bring to you a few metaphors, a few pictures, if you allow me. Please take a look at this map and try to see what's wrong about this map. And I'll tell you why this is useful to understand the way foresight improves decision-making in the present. Now, usually at this point, I would engage the audience in telling me what they think is really wrong about this map, but we didn't have the bandwidth for that. So I'm just gonna blatantly tell you the solution. Now, of course, this map has a lot of problems. There is no border at the top. Florida is just but a very embarrassing outcropping there. But the biggest problem in this map is that California is not an island. If you see on the left side of the map, you will see that there is an island called California, and that is not really the case. Now, what happened here is that several explorers came to California from different inlets of water, from the north and from the south, and they talked to each other and they inferred that California was an island. Now, unfortunately, this was drawn into a map by a Dutch map makers a few hundred years ago, and several Spanish explorers actually used this map. So they landed in North America, and because they were expecting to find sea from the other side, on the other side of the island, they dismantled all the ships they had, and they put all the pieces of their ships on mules, and they started to bear walk to find the sea at the other side of the island, but they actually found the desert of Nevada. So long story short, this wrong map has informed wrong decisions along history, and it made a lot of explorers incur into a lot of monetary losses and loss of resources and time, etc. So this is a metaphor to tell you that when we do foresight, we want to create a better map of the environment. We don't want this very bad case scenario to happen. We don't want to have a bad map about the environment that will inform bad decisions in the present. And when I say the environment in the context of foresight is we want to create a better map about the future. And how do we create a better map about the future? Well, that's how we do that. If you think about this gray stain that you see here on the screen as all the possible scenarios that can possibly or plausibly happen in the environment around us, the purpose of foresight is to map this gray stain by creating scenarios at the fringes of the stain. In other words, the scenarios must be extreme enough so that when we do them, we simulate all the other less extreme occurrences, right? And this map, actually, it seems quite a simple picture, but it naturally does away with quite a misunderstanding of foresight. And the misunderstanding is the following. When we create scenarios, we don't want to be surprised by a scenario that we have not created. A lot of scenario planners or foresight practitioners actually fall into this misunderstanding. And I want to bring this misunderstanding to you early on so that you don't fall into this. When we create a range of scenarios, we do not want to prepare only to those scenarios we have created. We actually use a sufficiently comprehensive and exhaustive set of scenarios to be prepared about the futures in general. That is why foresight is so powerful, and it gives us this capability of being prepared to the futures in general. So when we create 5 scenarios, we don't want to be surprised by the 6th scenario, right? Okay, another picture that can tell us more about why foresight is so important in the present. Please take a look at this picture and try to see what is wrong about this image. Again, apologies for not involving you directly in the discussion due to bandwidth constraints. What is wrong about this picture is that there is a bridge. For those of you who didn't fathom this out, that's a bridge. And on the right of the bridge, there is a river. But the river is not under the bridge, right? So the bridge is not over the river. That's quite a problem. Now, what happened here is that when they built this bridge, the river was underneath. But rivers shift their courses, right? And over time, that's what happened. So we can think about this picture as a metaphor to imagine our worst case scenario, our complete failure of planning. And we want to avoid that. And how do we avoid that? Well, we avoid that by simulating such worst case scenarios on a repeated, regular, daily basis, right? So that's what we do with foresight. And that's why it's important to take decisions in the present. We do simulations because it is better to be surprised by a simulation than be blindsided by reality. I like this quote a lot. It's unclear who I should credit for this quote. Some people say it's Jane McGonigal. Some other people say it's Jake Danagan. But anyway, it seems to be originated from the California Institute of Futures, the Institute for the Future. So just to give some credit to them. All right, now you know what it is and you know why it's useful. Let's get to brass tacks. How do we practice foresight? What are the stages? What are the specific stages I have to go through when I practice foresight? And there are 4 stages. In the first stage, we do what's called framing. So we define a topic. Now, of course, you can imagine you can do foresight for a number of things, right? If you are a mobile phone company, you will do foresight about the futures of technological development. If you are a country, you can do foresight about geopolitical developments in the futures. If you are a production company, you can do foresight about the futures of entertainment and so on, right? If you are a regulatory agency, you probably can do foresight about data, the futures of data collection and data compliance, right? So in framing, we really decide the frame, the topic of the project. Sorry, I went up instead of down. All right. Now the second stage is called scanning. In scanning, we look at all the trends and building blocks of scenarios in the present, all the patterns and trends in the present, right, that we see now that affect the futures that we're going to look at, the futures that we have decided, the topic that we have decided in the framing part, right? So that's scanning. We're still not in the future, we're still in the present. Then in the third stage, we move into futuring. And this is arguably the most central part of foresight, when we interpret and combine all those trends and patterns of change that we have seen in the present into long-term scenarios. And we can do that in a number of ways, depending on the method, but the common denominator is that we create narrative or other kinds of scenarios. And finally, in arguably the most crucial part of foresight, we use the insights obtained from those scenarios to inform or even overhaul or reconfigure the strategy or the practices of our organization, community, or institution where we practice foresight. So as you can see, these 4 stages are sequential in that the output of each stage can be used and is used as an input to the next stage, and they fit really into each other quite well. You cannot do 1 or 2 of those components, you will miss the whole picture, right? And I'm going to talk about how and why it's important to do all of those 4, especially the last 2 at the end. Okay, 1 more picture for you, and then I promise I will stop. There is one thing that is very important about those 4 stages, and that thing is that we need to collaborate when we do those 4 stages of foresight. If we do not collaborate, well, then something like this picture happens. And I'm not gonna let you wander there. I'm just gonna give you the solution. What happened in this picture is that somebody up in the hierarchy of an organization, a building and construction organization, said to their subordinate, you have to put a pole here in this point on the map. And that person lower in the hierarchy went and did just that without realizing that there is a road and probably there should have been a communication between the levels of the organization. So bottom line, why am I showing you this picture? Well, when we do foresight, when we talk about planning in the futures, we need to do it together, right? We need to involve different stakeholders in a social system at large. So we are at the same on the same page, right? The futures is built together. And if we do not do that, several problems will occur. And you can think of the metaphorical reverberations of this kind of situation that you see in this picture in your organization or other organizations as well. Okay. Now, going back to the 4 stages, and I'm gonna close with this concept here. I'm gonna call your attention about a couple of things to be very careful when you will start to do foresight in your own organization. You will probably be very attracted to scanning, and that is because in the public domain, there is a lot of attention on scanning, and scanning again is trend analysis for the layman, right? Is looking at all the building blocks and patterns and things that you can see now in the present that are emerging, or better, leading to the emergence of a different future. Now, scanning is important, and I'm going to tell you about how important it is, but also how careful you have to be when you do it, and making sure it's not the only thing you do. So scanning is important because what you're going to do most likely, especially in the frame of this emerging concept of anticipatory compliance, is that you will have to look for weak signals. That is one of the components of scanning that I would call your attention to. Weak signals are those single examples of change in the present. Again, we're always looking at the present when we do scanning, limited in geographical scope, and of which few people might have heard of, that have the potential to become forces of change in the future. So weak signals are really the starting point, the signals, that's why we call them signals of change. And I bring an often cited example to allow people to understand weak signals. If you have 2 scientists that manage to teleport an object from point A to point B, that is a weak signal of a potential force of change in the future. That might be teleportation. Now, of course, I'm exaggerating. I'm doing a bit of a science fiction-y example here, but just for you to understand it, right? And there is a particular method of weak signal analysis that I'm a big fan of when we do foresight in public organizations, and that is called emerging issues analysis. It was created by Graham Molitor, so credit to him. He was a civic servant and foresight practitioner in the United States government. And what he said is that we need to anticipate weak signals when they are at the very early stages of a 22-step curve that you can see here on the right. That is called the Molitor model of change. And the Molitor idea is that you have to see weak signals in the environment around you when they are at the stage of ideas or innovations or events or issues way before they are widespread in the public domain, because when they are widespread in the public domain, and that's the top of the curve, that's too late, right? We have to see them emerging and affect them while they are emerging. So as you see, weak signals, which is a kind of scanning, and scanning in general, it is very important when we do Foresight in public domain, because you can think of a number, I'm sure that you can think of a number of weak signals now in the present that if they enlarge, right, they will bring so many legislatory and compliance, technological, social, and value-laden concerns that we want to know about beforehand, right? So of course, scanning is very important. But in closing, I also want to tell you something that should warn you about scanning. Scanning is not the same thing as a complete Foresight approach, and that is scanning, futuring, reconfiguring. And I'm saying this to you as a warning at the end of this talk, because I see that a lot of public governmental Foresight, so to speak, it just stops at the scanning stage. Now, just to relate the importance of a complete Foresight approach to you, I'm just going to use another metaphor. At this point, you might have seen I'm a big fan of metaphors. If you recall, about 15 years ago, Nokia, the mobile phone company, came up with a new series of phone, the N95 series of phone, and also with a new operating system, the Symbian operating system. Now, they created that as a consequence of a lot of scanning activities. And the scanning activities told them that the future emerging, so the trends in the present, right, back then about in 2008, 2009, those trends were telling them that the future emerging was a future where GPS and MP3 functions would be embedded in mobile devices. So what they did is that they put all their eggs in that emerging future basket. They bet all their resources on this new technology, the Symbian technology. And what happened is that in the span of 2 years, everything changed because new actors with different dynamic capabilities forayed into the mobile phone market, and the app market was born, and Samsung and iPhone, as we know very well, managed to reap the large part of the market share, and Nokia failed miserably. In the span of 2 years, it lost something like 35% of its market share. Now, this is a cautionary tale to remind us that if we do only scanning, there is a danger that we're going to super focus, right? We're going to over focus on the emerging futures, right? And that is but one future. That is actually also quite powerful because it seems that it's going to happen. We are experiencing, right? We're starting to experience it, but let's not be misled by that, because other futures might actually occur. And how do we anticipate other futures? Well, we do that with a thorough Foresight approach. Now, just to make sure I'm not misunderstood here, I'm not saying that Nokia should have predicted the future of app market, right? I'm just saying that Nokia should not have stopped at the scanning stage and put all its resources on the future that was emerging thanks to their scanning activities. They should have taken into account other possible futures and differentiated their eggs in different baskets. So at the end of the day, we go back to complexity, right? If we look at one future, it's reductive. We want to look at a variety of factors and a variety of trends intersecting each other, and that's scenarios in plural form. So I hope that this short lecture gave you a quick but incisive introduction, and that it provided you some inspiration for the rest of the day and for your practice. I thank you for your attention. I do welcome any comments and questions. Thank you.
So do we have any questions for Alex? Everything clear, apparently. Anything? So I just give the floor to the panelists and thank you.
Thank you, Alessandro, and thank you everyone joining us online. I know there's probably more of you through the internet than there are possibly in the room, but it is wonderful actually to have a feeling of people back together again post-COVID. My name's Jennifer Baker. I'm an independent tech journalist, and I'll be moderating this panel where we're looking at different perspectives of anticipatory compliance. So I'm delighted to welcome on the panel here with me in person, as I say, very unusual to be saying that, but lovely all the same, Viviane Arts, who is advisor to boards and CEOs, but a well-known thought leader on data protection, who will be giving us an intro presentation as well. Then we'll go down the line. We have then Gian Claudio Maglieri is the Associate Professor of Law and Technology at the Augmented Law Institute of IDEC, EDHEC Business School in Lille in France, and also co-director of the Brussels Privacy Hub, whom we know very well. We also then have Dr. Gabriele Rizzo, who is the Director of Research for the Swiss Center for Positive Futures at the University of Lausanne, and has a PhD in string theory and astrophysics, which I hope he will not be talking about today too much. We also have then, last but by no means least, we have Stefano Liucci, who is the legal and technological expert at the EDPS, European Data Protection Supervisor, and his main responsibilities concern strategic foresight and new technological trends and financial matters, which he will be talking about today, I certainly hope. I think, Viviane, I'm going to invite you to make your way over to the podium. We know this subject today is incredibly important. A recent phrase I heard, and of all people, it was Max Schrems said it to me: you can't unboil an egg. And the other element that we all know so well here in Brussels is unintended consequences. So these two things together, I think, mean that we really need to take anticipatory foresight seriously. Viviane, are you ready? Yes, you have a fantastic presentation there. That looks terrific. And so I'll hand the floor to you.
Super. Thank you so very much. And thank you very much for inviting me to be here today. It's an absolute pleasure. So, anticipatory compliance and privacy culture. Let me take you through. What we've got is quite a comprehensive presentation, but I think there's a workshop this afternoon. So we're going to deal with stage 3, which is the culture of privacy, perhaps a bit later. But what I'll talk you through now is the Global Privacy Culture Survey, and then the machine learning project, Project Bell, which is actually about predicting privacy risks. So this is very practical. We've had a really interesting introduction this morning. I was taking notes, and I have to say it did stretch my brain quite considerably, the topic of foresight. But this is actually a very practical, hands-on approach to achieve the effect. So how do I, it just takes a minute, doesn't it? A little bit about privacy culture. So privacy culture was set up by Steve Wright, who is the CEO, sitting in the second row over there. And I've known Steve for many years in the privacy world. And when he set up privacy culture, I was really interested in the name, because it wasn't privacy compliance, which we all know about. It was very much culture. And of course, culture is such a huge determinant in our world. And particularly having come from more than 20 years in the financial services sector, I very much understood the importance of culture within an organization and how that can actually drive behaviors and drive change. And so privacy culture was set up. So I said, Steve, tell me a little bit about what you're doing. And he told me about his consultancy. And then he told me about his maturity survey. And I said, oh, I'll have a little bit more of that. And as a chief privacy officer, I looked at what he was doing in terms of measuring maturity within organizations, and then actually sharing the data back, not only with those organizations, but more broadly, in order to actually measure privacy effectiveness, which is utterly unique. And so we agreed to do a pilot project with him, both within my organization and then across many others. And that was, so I'm actually really pleased to say that we were very much at the start of this journey with Steve, which is incredibly practical. So that's my perspective on privacy culture, and which is why I'm now supporting Steve in terms of his venture, because what he's doing is very much cutting edge, and which is where we should all be. I don't think my clicker is working. Do you think it's working? Because it does seem to take a bit of a while. No, I thought that was a double click. There you go. No. Takes it, okay, it takes its time. Point it down that way. So what I'm going to talk through now is the privacy culture survey results. There we go, finally. Super. So the way in which it started was actually, legalistic, practical, the things that we know. So there were 12 privacy domains that sort of informed the survey. All of this is very familiar for privacy practitioners in terms of, what are the issues? Governance and accountability, retention and deletion, security, etc. So these are all the things that we need to do. And what the survey did was actually map all of these activities to all the different legislation that's out there, not all of it, but the main ones that most countries are actually complying with. So a very logical approach to the actual framework. And what that came up with was the actual maturity survey, which was looking at what are the things that you need to do, and can you measure whether or not you've done them? So do you have a policy? Do you have a process? Do you have an activity around retention and deletion? And it was phrased with sort of about 60 questions that you asked your staff, do you have one of these? Does your program look like this? Etc. So it was very practically focused in terms of these are the things that you're required to do in terms of privacy, and do you have one of them, as the case may be. But I think everyone realized that there's a huge difference between tick box compliance and actually culture. And this is the actual magic ingredient as far as I'm concerned, which is you can answer the question and you can have a policy and you can have a process. But if your staff have no idea what they're doing and don't value it and don't think it's their responsibility, if they think that it actually sits elsewhere, then what you don't have is much maturity, and you don't have a culture of privacy. So the behaviors are not there. All you have is a framework, and effectively it's privacy on paper rather than privacy in practice. And so working with academics and thought leaders and so on, privacy culture developed a series of questions, and it's done on that sort of scale where you sort of 1 to 7, I am responsible for personal data, which I collect and use to do my job. Do I agree with this? I'm sort of neutral about this, or do I very much disagree with it? And that was able to measure the sentiment within an organization and that real sense of accountability with individuals. And that generates, together with, have you got all of the prerequisites, the obvious things that you need to, together with actually what do staff feel? Do they feel that they understand this? Do they feel that they're accountable? Do they feel that they actually have the training they need in order to execute? Or actually, is this all very theoretical and lovely? And as long as it stays on the intranet and doesn't bother with my job and my life, then we'll all be okay. So that was the people part of the survey that he did. And what was interesting is that we saw in the 2 years that has now taken place, what were the areas of most focus. So when I did this for my organization, I was able to determine those business areas where actually the effort I had been putting in, when it generated an actual result, and then other parts of the organization, depending on, well, the effort I'd been putting in, did it even land? And some areas it landed and some areas it didn't. Thankfully, it was reflective of where we had focused our priorities, so that part wasn't a surprise, but it could very well be quite a a revelation, shall we say, for many organizations. And so on this one, what we can see is certain shifts over these last couple of years, which have been extraordinary given that we've been in the pandemic, around where the focus is actually at present. So it was very much on data breach management, but now it's on compliance and monitoring as the number one area of focus, which is interesting. And then just as a visual, to give you a sense, one of the things you can drill down to is where are the changes and trends on a specific department. So on this one, what we've done is taken the HR department. Has there been much of a shift in terms of attitudes, behaviors, culture, knowledge, and perceived control? No, not much. But then that probably reflects the fact that, you know, HR departments always handle personal data. They have a better depth of understanding of their responsibilities. And actually, there hasn't been any sort of massive change in that space in the last couple of years. But if you think about marketing, there's been so much legislative change in that space, so much uncertainty, cookies, ad tech, etc., and also that shift to digital marketing over the last couple of years versus in person. And then we're seeing that change in the trends as a result. So that's the awareness and such like from within the organization. I pressed it, so I'm gonna see if it goes. It did. So what were the conclusions? Effectively, from privacy culture perspective, the ambition really is to develop the first consistent methodology for assessing privacy effectiveness within an organization, and then that can be used to benchmark against other organizations. So, you know, what does the chief privacy officer get asked all the time by the board is really, how do I compare? You know, it's costing me a lot of time and effort. It's really important to our organization, but how do we compare to our peers? And the benchmarking is really essential. How to measure good practice, which we haven't been able to do before. You know, it's a bit like the broader piece on in terms of ESG. There's lots of information out there, but is it good quality information? And then the final piece is really about embedding a culture of privacy within an organization rather than just a culture of compliance. So Project Bell is the next step in this process. And it's a machine learning project that has been initiated. And it's about understanding how we can use different data sets to predict risk using machine learning. So the work that we've been doing in relation to the culture survey will feed into this, but this is very much the next step, and I think is reflective of what we were discussing earlier today. And the idea is to build a proof of concept to enrich the understanding of risks for clients. So the objectives are using internal and external data sets, because they're both really important, that can be combined to build the predictive model. Then you add the risk calculation to the different data sets, and then ultimately you can test the outcomes of the machine learning model to determine how it can be applied within the privacy context. Good, super. So just a visualization of the previous slide. Effectively, you've got different types of internal data that you'd be collecting. Like you put that into the model with the risk leveling above and an assessment of enforcement action, and then you combine that with the external data, similar approach, and that will lead you to an accuracy score of the machine learning model. And these were some of the external data that was used to input into that model. So enforcement, countries, this is basically enforcement data, which articles had been violated and the type of violation, because that helps to determine the risk rating. I'm going to skip that one. Too quick. There we go. And this is basically the result. So it's actually quite interesting. The model that has been developed is able to give an 81% accuracy with 81%, the combined data sets, and that was less than 1,000 observations, but it is an incredibly positive result given the limited data sets that we had to work with, but the predictability sits at 81%, which is incredibly high in this space. So leveraging all those different data sets and the machine learning piece. So I think the punchline really is at the bottom here, which is that evidence is that the model is able to predict risk based on the country of operation. So you can actually drill it down to that. But the future models, you'll be able to broaden that out to an industry, a job role, a department, or a jurisdiction. So what that does is enables an organization to better understand where their risks sit and then take action in order to address that on a go-forward basis, which is so very crucial. So the future vision for developing that, did press it, good, is actually broadening it out. So beyond the enforcement data, which we've used for the initial proof of concept, into news updates, stock market updates, regulatory updates, broadening the scope of the external data, and then putting it through the process in order to generate what will be actually a complex dashboard, which is able to give you an awful lot more detail than we have at the moment. And again, a different visualizations. If you use the culture survey, the horizons work, internal events, the learning platform data, and then all of the external data sets, which we've talked about, it goes into the machine learning element of it, and then it can be visualized through the dashboard and the user interface. And then ultimately you can actually apply that to actions in your business that you can take in order to have a much more anticipatory and predictive approach to your privacy compliance and effectively build a stronger privacy culture within your organization. There we go. But what we need in order to refine this model and to build it out to the level of maturity is really, as everyone does, more data. There needs to be greater quantities of very good data, legal support for access and use of external data. Not all external data is freely available. Some of it needs to be acquired and purchased in different ways. We need to refine the user interface design. Obviously, in terms of the learning lab, more infrastructure and expertise to refine that particular model. And these are the different things that privacy culture is actually looking for in order to take this model to its next step beyond the proof of concept to something that is going to be scalable and global for future use. And this is a sort of a visualization of what we think it could look like in terms of a dashboard, so that organizations can actually see and read, where am I today? What are the things and the trends coming down the pipeline? Where are my vulnerabilities where I need to address actions in order to make sure that I'm actually ready for these changes coming down the pipeline? So you can have a single view on your privacy risk landscape that is bespoke to you, not what you do at the moment, which is reads an article from one of the consultants, which gives you the top 5 trends for the world today. But actually, this is what is mattering to my organization now and to my people and my processes so that I can do something about it within my space. And obviously, those are all of the other enrichments around that dashboard that can be visualized and customized for specific organizations. So I'm going to leave it there, but hopefully that's given you a taste of a very practical application of anticipatory compliance and how that can be customized for organizations in an individual way, because the generic is great, but it doesn't necessarily work in all circumstances. And actually what we really need to do is start focusing on how can it deliver specific impact for specific organizations in order to drive that change. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vivienne. I'm sure there will be some questions online, if not in the room, but we're going to move on, and it's going to be Jean-Claudio next is going to give us your opening thoughts. I know you don't have slides, but grab a microphone and give us your insight, please.
Yeah, I stay here to make things more, how to say, circular. We're supposed to talk 5 minutes, so I'll be very brief. Just to tell you, anticipatory compliance from the perspective of data protection, that is basically my topic. At the Brussels Privacy Hub, we are trying to develop this topic of anticipatory compliance with Alessandro also, I see Vincenzo, so there are people around that represent the hub. And basically the idea is 3 steps: augmented compliance, proactive compliance, anticipatory compliance. Proactive compliance means don't wait, just act if there's some principles to implement. Anticipatory compliance, in the way we understood it, so in strict sense, was anticipating future challenges, future pieces of legislation that are coming. And there are many. We can do just naming the acronyms. We could spend 3 of my 5 minutes, so I would. And how they are related with existing acronyms, so with the GDPR, with the e-privacy, and so on. And then there is augmented compliance. Augmented compliance, and my research institute in Lille is called Augmented Law Institute. Augmented compliance means going for technologies that could help the problems. So I would just like to touch 3 points: problem. In my example of data protection and legal tech. Problem, bad solutions, possible alternative, possible good solution. Problem, I mentioned yesterday at the other conference at the European Parliament, some existing problems that I think we have. Just to mention some that are more appealing and interesting to me. Fairness is a broad concept. We don't know how to put it in practice. Fairness can have a very superficial application. And still, you are compliant with the law. You can be compliant with the very superficial and minimal application of data protection principles, but still, this is neither wise nor really doing compliance in a broad sense. Fairness is a problem. Second problem is the consent fallacy, transparency fallacy, right? The whole Panelfit project was built on this challenge. What do we do with consent? Consent is great to enhance autonomy of research subjects, of data subjects, of consumers, but many consumers, many data subjects, most of them, maybe everyone, don't read, are not interested, and sometimes they don't perceive their risks. So what do we do to get out from consent, to overcome the issues of consent? Third problem, vulnerable people. This was a great topic of research in Panelfit. Panelfit is one of the few projects that focus so much on vulnerable individuals, as I was telling before to Federico, not just focusing on vulnerable people as object or subject, but also as addressee of the guidelines and bottom-up approach. So vulnerable individuals, we don't know how to define them, we don't know how to protect them. Last principle that is problematic is risk. Of course, big principle, but the data protection impact assessment has had a very superficial application so far. We had this superficial, sorry for the wording, approach based just on cyber risks, cyber security, but fundamental rights is much more. And this is the challenge here. How can you anticipate compliance if you still don't implement exactly what is written today in the law? Fundamental rights of individuals when dealing with their personal data, which is much bigger than cybersecurity. So these were the problems we were facing: definitions, fairness, and so on. Risk, consent fallacy. A bad solution, in my view, a bad solution are most of privacy-enhancing technologies. And I know this is unpopular, but I think that legal academia and privacy activists need to stress this point. Privacy-enhancing technologies like differential privacy, secure multi-party computation, federated learning. We had the whole tech talks last year at the Brussels Privacy Hub on these topics. apparently a solution, but they're not a win-win. First, we have a problem, problems of group privacy that are still on the table. If I can't identify you, it doesn't mean I can't harm you, right? So differential privacy is focusing a lot on privacy as anonymization. But privacy is not anonymization. Privacy is a fundamental right and is the relation of personal data to our fundamental rights, which is not just being in or out. It's also being manipulated, being stigmatized, being stereotyped, etc. So, and the side effect is that companies using privacy enhancing technologies are also out of the scope of the GDPR. So they are also out of accountability. So we still have harms, and still GDPR doesn't apply. So let's go for a positive alternative solution. I have a picture here. I know I was not prepared, but it was just from yesterday night. So it was from my students. We finished this course about consumer protection. I don't know if you can see it, but these were my students, and we were doing this participatory approach lab. So basically we were trying to make this laboratorial experience together and doing participatory design. So why participatory design? Why I'm so obsessed with participatory design? Because actually it solves many of the problems I focused so far. Fairness is a problem of power imbalance. So if we change the people that are sitting at the table of the decision makers, we are also in a way mitigating power imbalance. Second, vulnerable people. If we call vulnerable people at the table, we are making sure that their autonomy beyond consent fallacy can be taken into account, because a vulnerable person would probably accept no matter what, but accept consent and whatever. But if we call vulnerable people at the table and we represent them, this is a way we can solve. Risk assessment. Can we do risk assessment in a self-referential way? Risk assessment is assessing the impact on vulnerable groups. And Panelfit, the first letter of Panelfit, participatory. This is something that is totally underestimated in legal discussion, but I think this is a way of anticipatory compliance, because you look at the principles, you go beyond the principle, and you anticipate problems that you could have. And for businesses, this is a win-win, because they increase their trust portfolio, but they also give a lot of attention to long-term problems like fairness, like vulnerable individuals, and so on. So just to conclude, how we structured this exercise that could be replicated. We are trying now to replicate with some big tags or some legal tags. So basically, you imagine a group of people, and you try to assess the possible impacted vulnerable groups that could be impacted by that technology. In the example of yesterday, to make life easier to my students, we gave clearly identifiable groups. So in every group, 10 students, one had to represent minors, one had to represent mentally sick people, one had to represent LGBTQ minority, and so on. Then we had the CEO, we had the DPO, and the CTO in the group. They had to find three tools that are problematic and three possible solutions, making sure that everyone is here at the table. And then you actually, in a bigger perspective, and I conclude, you should not just look at the initial groups. You should, the first round is just the first round. You look for who is missing at the table. There's always someone missing at the table. There is always this problem of underrepresentation. So you should wonder who is the group that is not represented now. And it can be very, very various groups. We know the groups are dynamic and group can change. And it would be too easy to say, oh, these are the problematic groups. Discrimination law a bit failed because of that, because there were just these few groups. So basically, this was a bit the example I wanted to draw today with you about participatory compliance. There are many problems, of course, many problems. The first problem is ethic washing. Companies could just say, "Oh, we do participatory compliance," and then what? They call people that already know what they want to say. They and they're perfectly fine and with the ethics check. So regulators, EDPS. Let's help us. Let's do this in practice. The AI Act has a reference to participatory compliance, very minor reference. Article 52, voluntary, you can do it, but don't worry, you don't have to, right? So legislators should make an effort, data protection authorities should make an effort, and also, of course, businesses taking things into serious account. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jean-Claudio. You don't have to worry about the AI Act because it's human-centric. It's fine. And I know we talk about the fallacy of consent. I don't know, how many of you connected to the Wi-Fi here today? I'm in a room of privacy professionals. Did anyone read it? No, no. Okay, Gabriele, you have slides, I believe.
Yeah.
So would you like to take to the podium? Because the clicker, when it works, is over there.
I'll just call it for next.
So welcome everyone. I'll keep it short as well. I'm actually very thrilled of hearing some of the remarks by Gianfranco, because the participatory part is actually crucial in Foresight. Why I'm here today is just to walk you through very briefly in a number of reasons why anticipatory compliance has actually a great component of Foresight in it, and why today and this time is actually the sweet spot to start talking about how we look at the Foresight perspective in anticipatory compliance. So my opening remarks today, let's start with anticipatory, right? The anticipatory means that it's about anticipation. Anticipation is an innate quality, an innate capacity. It's about how complex systems imagine their future state and use that imagination to decide in the present. Everyone does that. Like, what am I going to have for dinner? Or should I bring the charger because my phone is going to die by the end of the day? Is it going to rain? Should I bring the umbrella, right? This is anticipation. It's innate. Now, how we use anticipation is not innate. How broad we can see futures is about the topic of future studies and foresight. Why do we need foresight? Because as Alex in his great remarks this morning actually said, we live in a world that is getting more challenging. There's a piece of complexity, you know, all the things connecting, but there are also other two forces, which I'm going to touch on just one today briefly. There are convergence and exponentiality. Convergence is the fact that we keep seeing technologies and themes intertwined together, giving rise to new innovations. And there's exponentiality. You can have the first slide pulled up, please. Yes. In the remarks of this morning by Supervisor Jaworski, he actually made a reference to Moore's law. That is an example of exponentiality, but actually it's a general property, mostly of technology and technology-driven innovations, of having their intensity multiplied by a certain factor over a definite amount of time. Now, for Moore's law, is we double the number of transistors over 18 months. Now, that amounts to a year-over-year growth rate. Now, if you accept that it is a core characteristic of how futures are being built and how futures are shaped by forces that are exponentiality, convergence, and complexity, then by the end of the century, we won't be having 100 years of innovation. So calendar year 2100 won't be innovation year 2100. It will be actually innovation year 22,100, right? So we are about to experience radical, immense, staggering shifts. Now, you may very well argue that, well, look, but Moore's law is one example of exponentiality. Why should we lift this to, it's a complete characteristic of how we see the future? Well, because actually there's plenty of others. I could just mention like the volume of data or the total bandwidth, but you know, if I can have the next slide here. Actually, there's research proving over 1,757 technology domains that 188 are growing faster or equal to Moore's law. So technology is exponential. And moreover, it's not just computer and communications, it's across the board. Next one, please. Okay, so technology is exponential. Why do I care? Good point. Because technology changes the way we work. So if I say to you that my co-founder's eldest daughter is studying agriculture, what do you think of someone like going in a field and studying crops and all that? Well, she is coding in Python. So it's not actually the agriculture I was geared for. And moreover, if you think of still converging agriculture with community ICTs like 5G, then an agriculture is also a drone pilot. A farmer is a drone pilot. Once again, this is not what we were prepared for. So this is yesterday. These are the things we were geared for yesterday. The present is not what we were thinking, and what's about to come is even less. The next one, please. These are disruptions. So we have to let go of prediction and start embracing anticipation. As also were remarked several times today, there's no single future. Now, I'd like to draw your attention to one of the most classic tools of futurists. That's the futurist cone. That's actually the embodiment of why we use the plural. Because there's an opening up of a range of futures that goes from the present to out in the time horizon that we're looking at. And there are several different tiers of futures, and all these dots here are the dots that Alex was referring to. So you can sample the very end part of the cone by saying, well, look, I need more scenarios so that I can understand that situation more broadly. And the futures cone is actually at the root of how we define foresight. That is the ability to illuminate the broadest volume in the futures cone of possibilities, trends, and themes to be in the future, so as to anticipate the loss of initiative and prevent strategic shock. So the futures cone is how we define the practice of foresight. By action. Foresight exists in action, exists in inner action. Foresight is a participatory endeavor. There's no ivory tower futurist that is going to tell you how the future is going to be. The next one, please. Because otherwise, that's the syndrome, the faster horses syndrome. Now, this wasn't really Henry Ford. This is a quote that started surfacing like in the 60s, attributed to Henry Ford, but who cares? It's cool. Now, and I'll just close it here, but next one, by saying that there's plenty, also the next one, of exercises, reports, works that has been done from the field that I'm coming from, that is defense and government, and we'll be very happy to talk if this through. There's these one, especially are examples of foresight that were brought forward in the PPP arena, public-private partnerships. There's the ACARE, there's Flight Path for the European Commission, there's the EXO agenda, there's the Excel agenda. So I'm very happy to discuss this further. But I mean, my final remark here is the reason why we need to look at anticipatory compliance today is to integrate a foresight-driven approach to how we're going to create the right terrain for this conversation to be ready at the right time. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I was very struck by that. It was only one thing I thought, yeah, I know that. You do have to bring an umbrella. It's always going to rain because it's Brussels. Stefano, are you going to take the podium or are you going to grab the mic?
I think it was
great.
Let me first start saying many thanks for having the DPS at Panelfit. We've been really working with Alessandro to make things work and smooth. And I think that here I need to be, let's say, recapping a bit what you guys said, even better than we did. Let me start firstly, closer. Yeah, always the same issues with microphone. Let me start from a very important point that Mr. Wojciechowski, our supervisor, took today. And he said, and really took note about this, we lack best practices and best methodologies to make Foresight a new normal in our data protection future efforts. So this is, to me, the key point where we need to start from. No? As he was saying, we developed this first project and was really a first attempt to make the concept of Foresight, flowing a bit in the organization. We didn't want to have an exercise out of the blue. We really wanted to grow and change the culture and make the very first step on it. We developed our methodologies, yes, but we really lacked something. We really lacked the possibility to tailor methodologies in a way that were able to embrace the full complexity, as Gianclaudio was saying, of the not only technological arena. The sonar was dedicated to anticipate the technological development, but also the multiplier effect of privacy and data protection perspectives, risks, but also opportunities. In fact, our reports always try to see how technologies can be of help. And again, the reference to privacy enhancing technologies, it's for sure need to be enlarged. What we would like to have here, it's really to find a way to use this kind of methodology and to evolve from here, and give the possibility to people around the arena to use the methodologies, hopefully together, hopefully embracing the need to have this multi-party aspects that you, Gabriele, you were mentioning. But let me also add another point about Texonar that I think is somehow missing. It's really the lesson that we learned. Texonar revealed as a huge and powerful and very smart tool of knowledge management. We are absolutely flooded by a number of quantity of information overload, and we really need to be able to shape this information in a way that extract the intelligence we need to be more effective, as our supervisor was saying this morning, to really have the final aim to avoid the risk to materialize and really shape the technologies to a more sustainable future. Because we really think that when the damages occurs, we fail. And somehow we fail the mission to prevent, to have a risk management approach. Risk is anticipation in itself. No? Let me try to make another step beyond from this. It's really trying to elaborate a bit more on how the system in general can evolve thanks to this new layer of anticipation. And what Alex, Alex, I know him. I got to know him exactly because he was the most inspiring people that I found. He suggested me to take a quotation. Maybe you, Gabriele, also know this, is from Adam Kahane. And he said, I'm really reading, Foresight means, at the end, moving people forward together. It's really the science of, let me do it improperly, by the science of the obvious. The science of what you need, what you know. I'm exaggerating, I know. But, immediately, when I think about data protection authorities, I immediately think about EDPB. That is the place where we, as authorities, always meet to try to have a common points of development in terms of technologies, in terms of all the other complexities around data protection. And let me also recap something that Wojciech touched upon. We have, also Gianclaudio yesterday in our other Panelfit event, prior consultation and data protection impact assessments are absolutely two seeds of anticipations that we already have in the GDPR. So from there, we need to continue our path. But really, what really surprised me was the super connection that I found in the report that the Commission published last year, saying, and I'm reading again, development and application of new technologies do not put data protection principles into question. We have good principles. We cannot say anything about this, but the challenges lies in clarifying how to apply those principles in practice in specific technology emerging trends. So this is another important reference. So the questions that continues to, nudge Texonar in its aim, it's really on what do we want to concentrate to create such complex, to embrace such complexity and conduct such complex exercise. And we risk a denial of service in some sense due to the increased information flow, and Foresight is our firewall to make a comparison between other areas. And at the GPB to embrace this kind of level, let me also say that it's really ideas as not a position. It's really elaborating a bit on what we were discussing. I see the place where this Foresight can be built upon, and with a multiple set of aim and multiple steps. And I think the first point is decide on which technologies and data protection concerns we want to concentrate more. On the other side, really start this involvement, putting also subjects, data subjects, vulnerable data subjects at the table. We risk to lose a bit, this part that is at the end our main aim of the discussion, with a strong and effective, dialogue between parties, because this is, as Gabriele was really eye-opening in this sense. No, this is Foresight. It's really putting people together to see, to have a multiple of the issue, and then design a set of scenarios, not just relying on the only possible scenario that it's obvious, but really thinking to the fringes of the future cone that you were showing us before. And those scenarios should really embrace the creativity of the group, really in the sense of imagining possible, plausible, even the most simple one, but even the most extreme one, in the sense of being able to clarify how to apply, what to do on data protection, and especially where to put the threshold, because the problem is what is acceptable and what not. And the last point, very important aspect that Alex mentioned today was we need to continue reconfiguring what we do on Foresight. So the last point is having this continued exercise in reconfiguring the positions and being able to be predictive in the sense. And this might generate a two-sided effect, because on one side we can have, we can try to instill this full into the full reactive approach that Mr. Wojciechowski was mentioning this morning, a more anticipatory work, a more anticipatory experience in the work that data protection authorities does, but also improve the credibility of the system as a whole, because this is where data controller can understand what is coming next, and understanding is a crucial aspect to what we were discussing for anticipate evolution of the system. So just to conclude, to me, the more I work on this field, the more I got convinced about something. Foresight and data protection are two sides of the same coin. It's unbelievable how how much late they touched upon each other, because it's incredible the point of connection I always found here. And and to me, it's not a possible direction. To me, this is the direction to follow, to make all the system itself in general plural and prepared for the coming changes. And thank you for.
Thank you very much indeed. And I know we've got people in the room, so you know how to raise your hands and ask a question, but I'm also going to remind those watching online, there's a chat function, you can use it, or you can type your question into there in the Q&A. And I'm sure I will get a nod from the front row if we have questions for our panelists. But let me start, Jean-Claudio. I wanted to ask you about the different ways that we balance the ethical and legal side with just the sort of due diligence compliance box ticking exercise. But I'm also going to add into the mix the question of politics, because I loved it that. I mean, we've got now apparently a political agreement on Privacy Shield 2.0 or Safe Harbor 3.0, whatever iteration you want to have. And I'm also, to be a little bit esoteric, thinking about the ripples in a pond from a Foresight point of view. Russia invaded the Ukraine, which meant, because of our worldview, Europe needs to change its energy reliance, which meant that the US had to ride to the rescue, which has meant that the European Commission has said, sure, you can have our data. We'll give you a Privacy Shield 3.0. How does one in an organization or a business anticipate that from the perspective of not just compliance, but from a ethical, cultural point of view, to use Vivian's words?
Well, this is the $1 billion question, but I can say that. So I will maybe just tell an anecdote of a discussion that we had yesterday with top-level data strategy director in Meta, Facebook. We had this discussion with some students, and we interviewed him, and we asked the same question: what is the role of ethics and the role of law? What are the standards that you take, right? And they said, if your big tech company is so big, actually you can't just stick to the legal standards. You have to look for alternative standards, social expectations, and so on. But of course, this is very much variable because people can change their expectations, and their expectations can be lower than the law. Sometimes the fact that we are not aware of our data protection rights means that our expectations are lower than the law from a certain point of view. Then if you look, of course, at the problems that Facebook has incurred in the last year, and years, it's, of course, they might say that they respected the law because, of course, Cambridge Analytica was a data breach, but the Facebook papers and Francis Hogan and all this stuff, it's not in strict terms a violation of GDPR or e-commerce or whatever, right? It was more a violation of expectations of social standard, like social political standard. So of course, I think the first thing is to put principles in practice and understand how you comply with that principle. In Panelfit, we, because I was part of the project some years ago, we were doing that. Principles are abstract, but we need a clear line from principle to actions. It seems obvious, but it's not done. Yeah, we don't do that. So I think this might be a first step. You can start from principles, then you have to go to the, and if we look at legislation, before the AI Act, we had the trustworthy AI document, right? For the high-level expert group, 5 principles, super abstract. Now we have the AI Act, super technical. If we manage to draw the line between those very general principles and the very technical details, we will see that there are some holes, there are some gaps. So I think this is an exercise we should all do. Regulators, authorities, principles, action, and we see where is missing. Of course, it's not satisfactorily replying to your difficult questions, but I gave my 20 cents for.
I can chime in here. Whenever there's a problem in putting where the boundary of our imagination should be, there is a theme of what we want to be able to prepare for. So, of course, one of the power of futures is that anything can be possible. Now, but for something to be possible, not just everything can be, because if everything is possible, nothing is real. So you have to understand where your limits are, because the limits are what are the intrinsic condition to unleash the power of creativity. So we need to understand what is it seriously that we really don't want to look for. Like, yes, we can imagine a future where we have world of worlds, or we can have aliens, or we can, I don't know, have an asteroid, right? Are we willing? Does it make sense? Does the organization want to have contingencies in place that are future informed so that they can have an efficient and actionable line of thinking or courses of action so that they can respond to that kind of scenario? Now, if the answer is yes, then of course, we can develop also that part of the futures cone. If not, okay, that's fine. But that is an assumption that has to be captured because, of course, aliens, you're kidding me. But of course, a 2-year pandemic, you're kidding me as well, right?
Well, let me ask Vivian to draw on a little bit what Gian Claudio was saying about the expectations of, I don't want to say consumer, but the citizen at the end of the day, of people, to give them their actual name. How important is that? Because in terms of an expectation management and in terms of compliance and in terms of the ethical side of it, it can vary. You know, we say that, for example, in mergers that's happened recently, we saw the WhatsApp Facebook merger, and you know, honest engine, we won't merge that data, but of course they did. And of course, any user kind of goes, you know, you shrug, you kind of knew it was coming, even if it wasn't strictly compliant. Was it ethical? I mean, could we look at this in a reverse way and say, well, it's kind of ethical because everyone expected it. It didn't break anyone's expectations, but it broke the law. So.
Yes, you're obviously featuring in complex and challenging questions. One of the themes that I've always felt was really important was the cultural dimension. And when we talk about privacy, I think too often we think of it as being a gold standard, a single perspective. And actually the cultural dimension is so very important, and that addresses the expectations piece. So, you know, what is a normal or acceptable behavior in the US doesn't necessarily translate in the same way in France, and wouldn't necessarily translate in the same way in Singapore at all. But, you know, at the end of the day, there are fundamental principles or fundamental outcomes which citizens expect, which societies expect, but it doesn't mean that we have to articulate them in the same way across all of those jurisdictions. We have civil law, we have common law, we have more open societies, we have more reserved societies. And that's based on, you know, their history, the way in which they've evolved, the challenges and threats that they have faced, you know, whether or not they feel comfortable taking risks or not, because that is shaped by the environment in which they have operated. Island communities feel very differently about their relationship with the world than those that share the same geographical space. And that is the absolute reality. I think one of the areas that I think we do need to spend a little bit more time focusing on, though, is how we articulate what those individual rights and expectations should be. Because I think we acknowledge that there needs to be, privacy is so very important, but what does it look like for the individual? And are we articulating that in a fair and open way? Or are we creating expectations which are unrealistic and don't reflect the world in which we are living? And I think often we talk about customer choice. And really, do you have a choice? So when you open a bank account, you don't have a choice about the anti-money laundering checks that are going to take place. They have to take place. When you apply for a passport, you're going to have to provide certain information, otherwise you're never going to get your passport. So not everything is a choice. Not everything can be consent-based. I think often we spend an enormous amount of time trying to create attractive language that also creates misunderstanding and misexpectations on the parts of citizens and consumers around what their actual rights are or what their actual choices are. But what do they really want at the end of the day is that their data is respected and protected. But that can be achieved technically, that can be achieved practically, that can be achieved legally. It doesn't have to be in one mechanism. It can be across a whole range and a spectrum.
Well, Stefano, perhaps you can build on then the idea of a risk-based approach and how that works alongside Foresight. With risk-based approach, we can talk from GDPR point of view. Claudio mentioned it earlier, the AI Act is heavily reliant on a risk-based approach. How do you see that merging with Foresight?
Yes, it's an important aspect because at the end, I think it's where all this connection between data protection and Foresight started coming. At the end, we can also see Foresight as a evolved risk management tool in the sense that help us in understanding scenarios that we can build where risk can materialize. We have the possibility. So risk is in itself built of possibilities, as we were saying. The risk is also very, as you said, entrenched in all the regulation, besides some more prescriptive rules. To me, the risk is very important when it goes to the agreement that Foresight can build between the self regulation that companies does internally and one that data protection authorities expects from the other side, but also the citizen, the social norms, what can be accepted as for example, legitimate interest, where to put the threshold. No, this kind of discussion need to start happening somehow, because it's really where we can move from a auto-centric position on deciding which scenario can be accepted and which not, to a more plural dialogue. I really believe that this is the center of the coin we're discussing here, how to really put around the table all the people to imagine the possible futures, and in some sense make the going beyond the norm itself, going beyond the fact that we need to have the entire risk management process in place. It is sometimes very artificial in its sense.
Gabriele, how do you view risk?
I was just about to say that. So.
I know.
So there's Foresight is clearly a way to tackle risk. So we are on the same page for this. I want to stress a language note here. That is, it's not risk management, because when you say management, there's an inherent quantitative part. Risk management implies that you can say what is, you can quantify what is high, low, and all the nuances in the middle of risk. So this implies that there's a quantitative dimension to Foresight that instead isn't, because the quantitative part is forecast. So Foresight doesn't give you data points. It gives you a panorama. It gives you bundles. It gives you scenarios. It gives you vistas on sets of futures. So in this sense, it can be quantitative, because you can actually infer metrics on the way you're building a number of futures. Say, okay, we've got 64 futures. Out of 48 of them, we get this. Okay, but that is not hard quantitative. It is quantitative because it's expert driven. It's group driven. It was what that group of people built under the facilitation of that set of futurists. But still, it is a data point. It's not a data point that would satisfy a chief risk officer, however. But what I'm saying is, in this sense, Foresight is a great way for the organization to understand risk better, to anticipate risk better. You said at the very end of your introductory remark before, and I took a note of that the problem is how to apply the principles to new and emerging S&T. And that's what Foresight does. It gives you a better and deeper and more actionable understanding of the context, when there the vertical expertise of the domain experts can root and give fruits that are ripe and actionable. So in this sense, Foresight can be seen also as something for which companies can start, for which we as promoters, as an anticipatory compliance, can start imagining a qualification process. As much as there's an ISO for risk management, we can think of having an ISO standard for a Foresight practice that's standardized within organizations so that they can offer better risk handling. That's also evident at board level.
Thank you. Inigo, I think you had a question. Do you want to come here and grab my mic?
Thank you. Yeah. Sorry for disturbing. I will just try to keep things calm a little bit. This is going to be a question, not a commentary, so you can relax, okay? So my question is pretty simple. When we think about anticipatory approaches and so on, I always quite unconfident on one point, which is that we usually deem this all, we put it all on the shoulders of, for example, a developer. In the case of artificial intelligence, it's pretty clear. The Artificial Intelligence Act is mostly relying on a kind of self-assessment, especially in all the preliminary stages. It might happen that finally a third party intervene. We know that not in all cases. I think that only in a few cases might happen. So one of the problems that I felt in that is that if we rely on self-assessments and so on, there's a problem, because if you are the developer, of course, it is in your interest sometimes that, that you design it in a way that works quite well to your interest. And if there are some kind of issues, probably some people will never notice that. Let's think, for example, in the case of bias. You got some type of bias. Some people individually will never notice that because it's almost impossible. So one of the problems that I find in here is, and this is my question, if we want to solve this, what are the real solutions? Because one, for example, will be the intervention of a third party in the preliminary stages, but this makes things very difficult in so many ways. It complicates everything and the chance will not work well. Another possibility will be, for example, introduce standards very soon, so as that, that you will have a kind of, that the self-assessment should follow some strict rules, and you should make a real declaration about what's going on, how things are going on, and we could have a common language if we introduce the standards. But the standards are in very preliminary stages. We don't have them. They don't work so well. So my real question is, how could we amend that? Because in theory, that works well, but in practice, it's so difficult to implement that if we don't have this kind of common approaches. And a last point, for example, in the case of Artificial Intelligence Act, some of the tools will be fed via non-personal data, anonymized data that are non-personal. And here we have something that is terrible. GDPR is not really applying to that. So you will have the tool, and finally, they will use your data to make decisions, but until that moment, GDPR is not applicable. And I think that really that's a kind of, a serious gap in all that. I think I made a lot of questions. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, to give it an anecdote, when we talk about, you mentioned bias and we talk about getting buy-in at different stages. Have you heard the one about the racist tap, the racist faucet? They developed a wonderful technology. The taps that automatically sense your hands under them was developed in California. And all the people working on it were white. And they went, these are brilliant taps. Look, it just comes out when you put your hand under it. And some of the black workers in the office went in, and it didn't work because they'd never tested it on black skin. So you have racist taps now, ladies and gentlemen. How do we cope with this from a Foresight point of view?
No, yeah, I mean, great example. But building on the risk issue that Inigo was mentioning, and also other friends here, the point is, I think there's a mess. So risk, when you so the GDPR has this open risk approach. You do self-assessment, accountability. Then we know 3 examples of high-risk scenarios. The EDPB complemented it with the 8 sub-examples. You can pick 2 of them, but national data protection authorities can make their list that can be applicable all in their country or in intranational data flows. So first, risks, just from this perspective, are a big problem. So we want to talk about anticipatory foresight. First, let's look at what are the risks. The AI Act is risk-based, the GDPR is risk-based, but they're not the same. I don't agree that the AI Act builds on the same risk approach, because the AI Act has clear risk steps: unbearable, high, limited, no risk. And there, because that was what the Commission said, clear legal certainty. I want you to be sure that you are in high risk, that you are in an unbearable risk, and it's different from the GDPR because it's not all to the freedom of the developer, right? But still, there is the risk assessment tool in the AI Act as an additional tool for high risk. So what is the difference here? And so maybe I think you were asking about solutions. Maybe I have 2, I don't know, not solutions, but inputs for further research. First, we know a lot about risk. We don't know anything about harms. Risk of what? There's no list of harms that algorithm can produce. There's a wonderful paper from Future of Privacy Forum 2017, updated 2019. They made a list of risks, very general, and not European Union based. The EDPS, the EDPB, they never made a clear, it's not your fault, it's impossible to do that, but fundamental rights, possible risks, examples, a list of examples. We have in consumer law. Unfair Commercial Practice Directive has a clear list of consumer, let's say, mispractices, but we don't have for risks. So the first thing would be, let's start from the unexpected future. No, not the unexpected, the undesired events in the future, but have them clear now. Well, what is an example of impeding freedom of impairing freedom of expression? Let's make some examples. I know it's difficult. Second thing might be, but this is more a policy-oriented and very radical view. What we were trying to propose, Frank Pasquale and I, a paper we will discuss next month in Boston, is let's flip the burden of proof. All AI activities and all data processing activities are illegal by default, and they need to prove with a justification that they respect the principles. So it's their duty to prove that you are not discriminatory, that you're not manipulative. It's just like it's the same way of risk assessment, but from a different perspective. And then the consumer, the data subject, has better ways to say, oh, let's dig deeper into the third point. Again, regulators and fines are important, right? So we can't give everything to the accountability.
Well, you mentioned what I was actually going to ask about, which is the harms. I mean, when we talk about risk, we hadn't up to now mentioned what are the potential harms. If something's risky, it might be risky, but if it's just a risk of a bump on the shoulder, then that's not a major harm. How do you view that, Stefano?
Yes, thank you. No, very important point. Thank you, Gian Claudio, about this. Make me thinking. I've been taking home with me this big points. To me, this all this discussion need to be operationalized some way, and even the scenarios somehow need to embed this kind of possible risk to be foreseen. But let me say what is not, what I think is not foreseeable in this sense is that the system itself will lose the capacity to adapt continuously, that actually the risk-based approach aims to, the possibility not to have clearly stated norms that at the moment when you come out with them are outdated and nothing else. You have a flexibility element there that to me is very important. On the same sense, perhaps it was the best thing to do at that time. What to do? We didn't know how to embed risk in this evolved process. So even to defend a bit, the system that worked so far. It's sure that from here we need to evolve, and we need to try to embed this kind of approaches, even looking at something that has been done, like good examples. You mentioned the credit system, the credit directive system, and so on. Here, the risks can be at least something more that we have. The scenario itself is some attempt to clarify how to embed principles inside specific scenarios. This is, I think, what we need to, as a first step, practical step. Then, Professor, I will continue thinking about this, because this is, at the end, the question, how to do this. But thank you for this.
Thanks. Actually, I really would echo the comments that you've made. And I think one of the challenges that we need to face is be careful about trying to solve all the problems of the future today. And I think one of the things that I find really important to keep in mind is that as human beings, we're fallible. And yet we seem obsessed with artificial intelligence and the fact that it must be infallible. But if it's created by fallible human beings, it can never be infallible. Now it can have exponentially fantastic consequences, and it can have exponentially dreadful consequences as well. And that's as a result of its ability to scale and the speed at which it can operate. Those pieces of it are really quite extraordinary. And I think I don't have a solution to this, but there has to be a middle way where we don't stifle innovation. We don't try and preempt any potentially bad thing that might possibly happen in the future, but instead we give ourselves sufficient leeway to be flexible to address the risks as and when they may evolve, recognizing, based on what we've been discussing here, is that sometimes it might be that wild card that is the future. Most of the time, hopefully it won't be, but sometimes it might very well be that. So we have the flexibility to adjust. But in the meantime, it needs to be a responsible process, but one which isn't one which is going to stifle innovation and slow down the pace of change. We cannot put the genie back in the bottle for an awful lot of this. And I think that's one of the things why anticipatory compliance is so useful, is what we can do perhaps is give ourselves guardrails, toolkits, and mechanisms to think ahead, to start preparing, to get our mind in the right place. So we're not reacting in the past, but you cannot shape the future. You cannot stop what is going to happen. But what you can do is hopefully adjust the direction of travel and give yourself the flexibility to take the measures that you need to if the undesired consequences happen.
Well, I think it's a lot of it's fear that we're developing artificial stupidity rather than artificial intelligence. And you mentioned, two of what I consider the three V's. You mentioned the volumes, the velocity, and I think the third one is the vectors. The where is this data coming from? What is being fed into it from the start? We have a question.
Yeah, so I would like to start by thanking you for some really thought-provoking and interesting presentations. It was really really fruitful, I think. Being part of the Panelfit project, I'm really happy to see that you've picked up this torch of participatory approaches. I think that's definitely the way forward. In that vein, I'm quite interested to hear what your take is on the role of citizens in this participation. Gian Claudio, you touched a bit on it, on vulnerable populations. And that's obviously both very important and very necessary, but there's also broader citizens to be engaged in this. And what typically happens in some policy-making processes is engagement of citizens by proxy. So you engage consumer groups or NGOs or other things. But what's the role of regular citizens here in this participatory compliance or anticipatory compliance framework that you imagine?
Who wants to take that?
Quite a hard one. Eh?
Yeah.
Let me try just to put one point here. If I stay on the data protection side, so leaving aside a bit all what is non-personal data, we have in the GDPR again one seed of this to involve the data subjects in the evaluation of risks and the impacts. No? So this is for sure one point, but they need to have people around the table, real data subjects, touchable data subjects. It's something that I have the feeling that we forgot a bit in time. And this as I was saying, the fact of being able and developing methodologies to do so, to be able to embrace all those complexities and the plurality of visions around the scenarios making process, to me is key. How to do this, again, to be put back on my bag and reason at home, but I don't have solutions. To me, very important point, this one, and part of the process itself of Foresight in general, I would say.
Yes, I'll add something here. The idea of involving citizens speaks to me as the importance of involving a very broad audience. Now, that speaks to, once again, the diversity of people that you need to engage when you run a futures thinking exercise. Now, I can speak to several different examples here. One of them being then with the recent experience that we had at the university. For instance, the one that led to the last book that we wrote, HR Futures 2030, that was hosted. The workshop that started all that was hosted before COVID. It seems like an age ago. We had not just HR experts involved. We had people from HR, people from the university, people from disrupting companies, and other disruptors at large, startups, students, other parts of the university campus that is a large campus with the Swiss Polytechnic School and 7 faculties in there. So diversity is it's where I'm adamant about Foresight. It needs to be diverse because otherwise you end up with the racist faucet, and you end up with faster horses. If you just are a group of people with all the same background, all the same culture, all from the same organization. You just keep patting yourself on the shoulder, and there's nothing new in the very end. And then what you end up with is a singularly focused bunch of futures that they all speak to just one group of people.
We can just
Yeah,
very
absolutely.
rapidly about your question. I want to play the devil's advocate about two terms you used. Citizens, I know is an important term in Panelfit, but citizen, I don't like that word, because citizen are just a part of vulnerable individuals. Citizenship is sometimes a topic of division, right? GDPR doesn't mention citizenship because it's not related to citizenship, it's related to being humans. And vulnerable people, I agree with you, we have to look at the bigger picture, but everyone is vulnerable under certain circumstances. So if the proposal that we try to do in an upcoming paper is one independent expert of the topic of that vulnerability, and one representative, a witness. The ICO is releasing guidelines about fairness, and I was part of them. And one point is participation as witnesses of that vulnerability, a parent, a representative, someone. And then you try to put them in the speech, in the discussion. Just one thing on GDPR I conclude. Article 35 doesn't mention just data subject. There is also another word that scholars didn't pick up, and other impacted people. So basically GDPR goes beyond its own material scope, which is quite a violation of its own rules. But who are these other impacted people? So maybe this is something we should reflect in the future.
Well, I'm going to push back a little bit and say, we don't live in a risk-free world. We get into a car knowing that there is the potential that it will crash. We don't design the entire universe to cater to toddlers who might crash off the edge of this stage. We accept a certain amount. So I think we need to work into it. Where is that line, and what do we as a society deem as acceptable? I think we have a question from one of our online viewers, Alessandro.
Yes, we have a question. It's not addressed to a specific panelist, but it's for the whole panel. And a question I'm reading out loud. So given artificial moral agent discussion claiming only human beings can be full ethical agents, the solution in the short term is assuring moral decision by algorithm developers. Do you think participatory compliance can achieve this goal? What is the major shortcoming do you think would be faced?
Okay, Vivian, you've reached for your mic first.
I reached my mic first. It's really interesting, that, isn't it, the question around morality and ethics, because there seems to be an expectation that there is a single value point for that, that there is one ethical norm that applies to everyone. And it sort of goes back to that whole principle, isn't it, that there is an ultimate good, and that can be defined. But the reality is that it depends on the circumstances, it depends on religious norms, on cultural norms, and so on. So I think we need, in our globalized world, is to recognize the diversity that we have, which goes a lot to what you were talking about in terms of making sure that lots of different views and perspectives are heard. And we with the increasing discussion around ethics, I think there's over 200 different ethical standards out there at the moment, a lot of similarity between them, but actually the fact that there's over 200 speaks volumes. There isn't a single ethic, there isn't a single moral compass. There's a lot of consistency around the outcomes that we're looking for, but I think we need to be quite careful about saying this is the ethical approach. I don't think that we actually have that. And when we look across our world and what is normal and what is acceptable for different cultures and different religions and different geographies, that is brought much more to the fore. But let's not focus too much on the differences. I would also say that there is an element of consistency and normality which we can achieve when we focus on those things that we have in common.
I mean, we have a commissioner now for protecting the European way of life. So, some consensus attempted here in Europe. Another online question. I know we're getting towards the end of time, Alessandro, but
yeah, so
if people are writing in questions, we'll let the panel tackle them.
Yeah, maybe these are going to be the last one, give it a time. But so the question is how to avoid that the foresight exercise, while identifying possible scenarios, including the worst one, can push although indirectly and wittingly, society towards that scenario?
That's part of the design. No, it's very interesting how there's some kind of luring of humanity into thinking that everything is going to be bad. Now, this is part of the discipline that we're opening that's called positive futures, because this was something that was meaningful when we were not the top predators we're today, because when we were like 10,000 years ago, when we were hiding ourselves from the actual predators out from the caves or out in the savannah, well, that made sense that we were kind of looking at the dark and the unknown as a place to fill with risks and predators. Now, what we do today is that we have to fill this predator void somehow. And the way we do it is by just being drawn to utopian and dystopian and completely dark scenarios. It's part of a good design of how to do foresight properly, to, as I was showing with the futures cone, as Alex was referring to, you need to structure the way you look at the future so that you're leaving no stone unturned. So it's not just we just sit down over a coffee and we think scenarios. That's not how you do that. You need to structure that so that you know what are what is the taxonomy you're following, what are the dimensions you're unfolding. So it is true that there will be a part of scenarios that will be dystopian, but also part of them will be utopian. And the most interesting are the ones where you're not in hell and neither in heaven, because that's where you have to understand how you're willing to do trade-offs. And by understanding where's regret and where's a trade-off and how you realize a win-win while in a constrained situation, you understand much more about the group dynamic, how you imagine the future, and what is relevant for your future.
Well, I think we've strayed far and wide through this conversation. I think we're all touching on science fiction and points here. But I think I'll leave each of you with a quick final word to wrap up, and then I know the professor has a presentation for us. Stefano, we'll go this way.
Difficult point. Let's say, let's try to find a way to build some kind of common approach, common methodology to do so. Let me come back to this point that I started with. Really, we need to find a way to agree on how to make a good design and then run it and then operationalize it.
Yeah, I'd bring this even forward. I can't agree more with what you just said, and I can overstate how important this is. I'd also add, let's find a way we can organizationalize this in a standardized manner so that it shows value for the organization through value for their stakeholders.
Yeah, just one sentence. I wanted to say maybe anticipating risks doesn't mean anticipating compliance, because already the law is requiring risk analysis. So just to say, businesses, data controllers, AI developers should not think that this is a futuristic thing. Of course, it helps a lot, but it's today a challenge to understand the risks for tomorrow. And it's a win-win for them, because if we internalize risks, of course, it's better life for everyone. And thanks to good legislations and good regulator.
I think there's a tremendously positive future in terms of anticipatory compliance, because it means that we're very much more in the driving seat rather than waiting for things to happen and just reacting. I think it's so important for us, both as organizations and societies and governments, to be looking ahead and doing that anticipation. We won't always get it right. It requires us to be open-minded about where that might take us, but at least it leaves us better prepared for the future, which is happening to us with increasing speed and with increasing change. And I think that is absolutely the way forward. So thank you.
Well, thank you all very much. Before I hand back to Alessandro, I'm going to take this opportunity to tell my one data protection joke. There's two guys in a bar and a woman walks in and one goes, "Oh, she's gorgeous." oh, and I said, oh, I know her. She's, you know, she's a teacher. She's really into ancient history. Her favorite beer is Lef, if you're going to bring one over to her. Oh, and she's allergic to peanuts. And she's got 2 brothers and a sister. And he says, great, I'm going to go and talk to her. What's her name? Oh, I can't tell you that. That's personal data.
Thank you for the very interesting panel and a very interesting discussion. So technically speaking, right now we should have 15 minutes coffee break. But, you know, after 2 years of online conferences, we were not really able at, you know, considering the buffer time of on-presence conferences. So I will kindly ask you to have just 5-minute coffee break. I know it's challenging, but I'm sure you can do it. We will reconvene in 5 minutes. Thank you.
For your attention, for being here. I think that my presentation, okay, that's here. So I mean, I've got almost an impossible mission because I have to synthesize whatever we have done in 3 years in 15 minutes. So, you know, I will try to do my best. Okay, hopefully I will be able to do so. So let's start with something that I think I gotta do. First of all, I would like to thank all those partners in Panelfit project. I mean, it's been a really long way, and it's been hard at some points. We all know that we have had to face pandemics. Okay, fortunately, most of the things that we have had to do were already solved at the beginning of this year. Most of things produced because nobody knows what the future might bring us. I'm usually an optimistic by default, but at this moment I don't really, you know, I don't know if I have to confess it, but nobody knows what's going to happen. Anyway, a Panelfit project. I think it's been a quite oh, sorry, something happens with this that is not working. Maybe next slide you could do it. Yeah. Well, Panelfit project, as Professor Romeo was stating at the beginning of this session, was a quite ambitious project that was based on a pretty simple idea, which was that the legal framework regarding data protection was changing. And when we were writing that proposal, we were just proposing something very simple. That was that we will try to help all of us to adapt it to this new framework. And all of us means citizens, DPOs, policymakers, and of course, those researchers who were working with in the ICT technology. So the point was that let's think what we can do to help them all. And all the design of the project was aimed at making that possible. So we decided to produce some different outcomes, and maybe we could go for the next slide. And that we're really, you know, trying to focus on these different audiences. So the first outcome that we have produced in Panelfit during this year is a critical analysis. Why a critical analysis? Well, this is pretty simple. Usually policymakers need to hear what type of things are not working so well, and especially some proposals on how to deal with them. In Panelfit, we mainly focused in 3 main topics. One was informed consent. The other one was a commercialization. And the other one was security, or the use of data for security purposes, including also some cybersecurity tips. And I think that critical analysis was, I mean, there were some good materials on that. Of course, it's pretty difficult to produce something that is really you know, quite well ajourné in these days, because we all know that lots of new laws are being produced. And some of the things that we were recommending in our critical analysis would probably be implemented by the new laws. That somehow it's quite successful that we managed to uncover those and propose some things. Some other topics will have to evolve probably, but we have this critical analysis that I think that it's pretty interesting and might help policymakers to deal with whatever might happen in the future. So the next outcomes in the next slide was a report on governance. This, I think, is one of the most interesting things that we have produced, and has to do with something that came to our mind, which was that, of course, we need pretty nice monitoring systems in order to guarantee that everything is working well. And so we asked one of our partners, that is EUREC, the EU research ethics committees to help us with that. Why was that? Due to a very simple reason. The ones that have worked for really long in monitoring the research and the new developments were probably ethics committees. They have a long experience in that. And one of the things that I was commented with some of you is that, for example, clinical trials is a typical example of very risky research that has to be implemented. And we have a lot of experience on that. And we can now understand more or less what's working well in that area and what is not working so well, and what could be done by kind of bodies such as research ethics committees and what cannot, and what type of composition will be necessary and so on, and what could be improved from that, so as to use that in other frameworks, such as, for example, data and, for example, artificial intelligence tools. And one of the things that we have in this repo on governance is a very nice, some very nice explanations of what they have learned during these years and what they consider about monitoring data protection and so on. And they show the weaknesses of the ethics committees, for example, and what should be necessary in order to help them do it in another way. We, for example, know the AI Act will need to implement some new monitoring systems, and this could be useful in order to deal with that. So the next one, in the next slide, is the code of conduct. In Panelfit, we are trying to push a code of conduct that serves well for research in the ICT field. I think that this is interesting per se, but could also be very interesting, such as, for example, the type of researchers that are trying to develop, or maybe the promoters that are developing an AI tool. And this due to a very simple reason. If you are not in a high risk AI tool, the new AI Act is proposing researchers and developers at least to follow some kind of code of conduct. So we are really proposing something like that. This is a code of conduct that you could follow. So at some point you will have a kind of a standard that someone who is developing something like this could really, at least have as a reference in order to do so. So I think that in the future, this type of code of conduct could be very useful for some concrete purposes. And if they are standardized and very precise, and the scope is not very wide, but really works well with what you are doing, that could be much appreciated. And this is what we have been doing with this code of conduct. Next slide comes with the next outcome. Next outcome is one of my faves. It's why that's a pretty simple reason. Usually journalists are the type of people who really, process a lot of personal data. And what they do is really important for us, extremely important in these days, I dare say. So the main problem that we have is that journalists that work in mass media usually have a splendid legal assessment, and they perfectly know what to do, what they shouldn't do. Those who are not, and there are a lot of journalists who are not working in mass media in these days, they are freelance, for example, are quite lost with this type of thing. So we just produce a kind of handbook that could be very helpful for them in order to let them go on with their activities, but keeping in mind some of the things that we have. But we will also providing some kind of advice to policymakers, just for saying, sorry, but sometimes it happens that we are using data protection issues in order to impede journalists do their mission, and this is not a good idea, and we should try to avoid that. So there's a kind of mixture at some point of that. So the next slide comes with the fifth one, and this is if I were to tell you what is my personal love in this project, maybe the info pack is one of that, and this is due to a simple reason. There are lots of information for citizens available right now, but as Gian Claudio was telling before, there are not so much info that is adapted to vulnerable population. And I think that this is really important because those people exist and they are vulnerable and their rights are not so well protected sometimes. The laws really allow us for that protection, but sometimes it's not so easy to make them aware. And we have made a tremendous effort to build it up. And I think that we have really been able to involve a lot of experts and representatives of vulnerable population just to let them know what we are doing and hear them. That is very, very important, hear their needs. And I think that we have produced some nice materials adapted to those vulnerable population. And we are me particularly, I'm very proud of this part of that. I'm also love the idea that we have to deal with vulnerable population and try have the right perspective. So finally, the last outcome that comes with the next step, maybe the most important or the most ambitious outcome that we have produced is what we call the guidelines that are available right now in this direction, guidelines.panelfit.eu. These are a kind of a quite impressive, if I dare say so, because we have more than 400 pages involved in that. So it's an online tool, but it's complex somehow because it's got a lot of information in that, and it's just helping ICT researchers, DPOs, and whoever else to have a nice information about what the GDPR is about, and what are mainly the legal requirements they have to deal with, and even some ethical advice. Especially in that point, we are now trying to complement that with some of the results of the SERPA and Siena projects that are somehow linked to us. So we are just trying to provide a global advice on how to do the things. Those are very interactive, meaning that you, for example, can go to the fundamentals of the GDPR, take a look at the concepts and so on. But you could also go to any of these different technologies that are being developed, such as biometrics, geolocation, artificial intelligence, and so on, or Internet of Things, and you will receive information on that. And if you want to go to a concrete concept, you can go from one part to another in a very easily way. There are windows that explain you concepts, and we have done it in 5 different languages: English, German, Italian, French, and Spanish, so as to make things much easier, smoother for those ones who are not so fluent in English, and make things easier for them. And we are also preparing a quite shorter materials, like 30 pages, which that will be a simplified thing that could be very useful in practice for so many ways. And there are lots of checklists that we all know that checklists are necessary. So there are checklists that more or less you could follow. So what we really hope to do is that they will become a kind of useful standard for those who are working on that. And we are really looking forward to complementing them in the future. I mean, Panelfit will end, but we will try our best at least to introduce some good complementing materials by stating, for example, in this concrete field, be aware that this new regulation has been approved. So please take a look at that and these concrete articles and so on. So as to make it a little bit more, something that really could be helpful in the next year, not only about the GDPR, but also with some other things. So that's more or less what we get in mind. And finally, in the next slides, I'm just showing you what we have done about dissemination and communication in this project. I can tell you it's been a really huge effort, especially under the conditions that we have to live with that. For example, here you could see more or less what we have, the expected impact at the very beginning and the impact that we really achieved. And I can tell you that in most of cases, more or less, we work very well. We produce a lot of academic papers and panels and so on. And especially we had a lot of encounters with the stakeholders and users and policymakers, meaning that what we were producing was more or less analyzed, but lots of different people who got involved in that. We received the feedback and we were improving materials thanks to that. So it was really a co-creation process with lots of people there providing information and opinions and so on. And everything was built on that. And so I think that this was, it worked quite well, even if the circumstances were not the best, of course, and we had to rearrange some of the methodology that we have prepared at the very beginning. And finally, in terms of the communication, that is the next slide, we have also produced lots of different things, and something that I can share that I'm also quite proud of. I think that Panelfit provide nice advice through quite different ways about how to use data in the context of pandemics, for example. And when just put some examples, we were producing articles that were published in quite important media, such as, for example, El País, El Mundo, El Corriere della Sera, Gian Claudio, if I'm not wrong, and so on. So there were lots of materials that were published in that, and we were giving interviews in radios, in national televisions, and so on, talking about data protection issues in the context of pandemics. We produced a lot of materials that were included in our webpage, and we were, I think, trying to support it in the best way that we could, even if that was not a primary task of the project, but we thought that this was really, something that we really had to do. And I think that we were quite successful in that. And we were very active in the discussions about lots of different things, such as, for example, immunity passports, but also the apps and so on. So that was part of us. So I think that finally, I just can tell you the last the last one is that one of the last things that we have also created a repository about what we have about the new regulation and some interesting materials, and you could all gain access to that. It's public, and we could do that. That's the mutual learning platform, and you could also introduce some opinions and so on. So it's quite interactive. And last but not least, I think one of the things that we did, one of our partners indeed, that's produce an impressive document about identification, pseudonymization, and anonymization. That's one of the most difficult things to face from a technical point of view. And I think that I really recommend you that if you want to get in deep with that, that's excellent materials produced by the German Data Protection Authority. That's one of the partners in Panelfit that was made in our context. And we are also very happy about that. Nothing else, just wanted to thank you again, especially to the partners, to our project officer, Monica, who's been splendid in so many ways. Thank you so much to Roberta for your patience. Thank you, Lisa, Dorian, Aldena for your support. Really, we have been very lucky. I mean, I know people usually tell you, but one of the reasons I really, tell people that this is a good idea to work on something like that is because you learn a lot and you got splendid people that will really help you. And this is one of the things that we thank the most. So thank you so much, Roberto. Thank you so much for all of you. Thank you.
So we are at the end. Let me relax a bit. I will unbutton my jacket. We are all tired, we're all hungry, so I will try to be extremely brief. First of all, let me thank you, all of you, for being here today, the attendees in the room today, but also the people who connected remotely via Zoom, the speakers who produced astoundingly interesting presentations. And of course, as Inigo mentioned, all the people from the Panelfit project and all the organizers who actually made this event possible. So today we heard a lot about foresight and future studies. And when I discovered this term the first time a few years ago, I was very, very, very skeptical about it, because I thought that it really didn't make any sense. Because if we know how to anticipate the future, then we should all live in a very different world. But then I stepped back a little bit and I let curiosity win over skepticism. And I tried to approach this topic from a different perspective. And actually, Gabriele told us, I was thinking about the fact that we all anticipate our behavior in our daily lives. And Gabriele told us, it's an innate capacity that we have. So it's not about voodoo magic. It's just about putting a structure, methodology to this, innate capacity, this creativity that we have as human beings. Okay. And so I started thinking, okay, how can we use this creativity in the context of compliance? Because of course, this is what I work with. And then, this idea of anticipatory compliance started to emerge in my mind. And I thought, oh my God, this is a brilliant idea. I'm a genius. But of course, I was late to the party. I was very late to the party because as seen today, relevant stakeholders, organizations, scholars, they were all already thinking about this. And they all had their ideas about this topic. But it's good, nevertheless. I mean, we have something here. We have something concrete that we can work on. And it was fantastic today to hear the private sector point of view from Vivienne. It was great to hear from John Claudio, who actually told us how certain things that already exist, like participatory design and participatory approaches to compliance, fits very well into the into this profile of anticipatory compliance. And it was great to hear from the EDPS, Stefano and Mr. Wieworowski, not only hearing that foresight and future studies is one of the strategic pillar of an organization like the EDPS. This already tells us something, but also by giving us concrete examples on how they're working on that with the Tech Sonar initiative. So I think that it is clear enough. The speaker stressed enough. Also, Alex said that nobody has a crystal ball. Nobody knows the future. Okay. Foresight is about giving a structure to help us doing better decision making. Okay, and this is where we have to push forward. And the speech from Inigo, I think it made quite clear why this conference, this Panelfit closing event, was the perfect venue to present this topic, this aspect. The Panelfit project, with its forward-looking approach to create a new framework, okay, was the perfect project to develop this idea. And also with some of the deliverables we produced, like the guidelines, Nico mentioned that. In the guidelines, we looked at innovative technologies and how these technologies impact data protection activities of organization. However, I have the feeling that it is not enough. It is not enough. There is something here, but we have to push forward. And the moment probably is historic because the need is clear. The overall approach is kind of outlined, maybe roughly, but at least we have it. And the stakeholders to be involved have already been identified. So now it's time to connect all these elements together and move forward to create something tangible that goes beyond like an academic conference like the one that we have today, something that can be implemented by organization. And actually, Mr. Gaborowski said that to us. Between the lines, that was a quite clear call to action. Develop something that we can use in a very concrete and tangible way. So it's up to us now. It's up to us now. The Panelfit project has come to the end. But of course, we will keep on working on that. And we would like other actors, other stakeholders to join us, because as you know, the acronym in Panelfit said, this is a participatory work. So I really hope that we will be able to create something that can be valuable for our organization. And I hope we can do it soon because it is much needed. So I will stop myself right now. I hope you enjoyed the conference today. For me, it was fantastic. I learned so much. Now, before you leave, some of you will attend a Panelfit meeting in the afternoon. We will reconvene here at 2:30. For everybody else, thank you very much. It was a pleasure having you here. It was a pleasure having people connected remotely. I really hope there will be other chances now that we're getting our lives back and we are starting again with these in-presence conferences. And I wish you all a lovely day and a lovely continuation of the week. Thank you.